I want to give you an image which maybe some of you have seen, maybe for some of you it's nostalgic, but it's Grand Central Station. Have you ever been to Grand Central Station? It's probably one of the largest buildings, certainly in Manhattan, if not in the country, and who knows about the world. But it's this cavernous train station. The ceiling is an incredible representation of the zodiac on some level, with stars shining through. And if you can get up above and look down, what you see are people rushing for trains, rushing from trains, rushing to subways, tourists gaping at the size of the room, homeless people, of course, it's New York, sleeping on benches, New York City cops patrolling, vendors selling whatever they can. It's an incredible building. It's one of the busiest, probably the most congested places in all of one of the more congested cities in this country, in Manhattan. So it was probably no different. If that's what it looks like now, it was certainly no different 13 years ago. And 13 years ago, 2003, somebody came up with the idea of putting a StoryCorps booth in the middle of Grand Central Station. Now, in the middle of all that chaos, they plunked down a sound booth. And at the sound booth, what they invited was for people to come inside and speak the stories of their lives. It was kind of a crazy idea if you think about it. Take the most chaotic place in the center of one of the most chaotic cities in the country and put a sound booth and tell people to step out of the chaos and into the quiet. That's what they did. And they invited an interviewer and interviewee to step inside, and the door closed, and all of a sudden, in the midst of all this noise, when the door closed shut, there was silence, and people would step in the booth, and they'd tell their stories. A father and son step into the booth. The father tells his now adult son about what it was like to be part of the first wave of soldiers to land on Omaha Beach during D-Day. He never told him the full story. His voice, as he tells his story, breaks frequently with emotion in the recording that I heard, even 60 years later, as he remembers his dead buddies on the sand around him. The door opens, they step out, a couple walks in. The door closes. Everything's silent again. Now it's a husband and wife. He asked her what it was like to care for him during the time he fought a disease that nearly paralyzed his entire body. She told him of how, after they moved and sold all they had to pay for his treatment and transferred themselves to Seattle, she had to live in her car because they didn't have enough to make ends meet. She tells him what it was like to live in the car. Then she tells him what it was like to see him take his first steps after 6 months of paralysis. And with tears in his eyes, and you can hear his voice crack, he thanks her, and he promises her that he would do the same for her. So StoryCorps was the brainchild of a gentleman named David Isay. And it was his belief that everyone has a story that's worth telling. And he believed that if he built that booth in the middle of the most chaotic spot in one of the more chaotic cities in the country, people would actually step inside and tell their stories. And astoundingly, he was right. And to date, because it's still going on, thousands and thousands of people and thousands of stories later, he's been proven correct. There are StoryCorps booths in LA, and Phoenix, and Chicago, and San Francisco, and there's even a StoryCorps truck that travels around to the other smaller cities, and people walk inside. There's even an iPhone app. Of course, there's an iPhone app for that. And every story is recorded and preserved and secreted away. It's not really secreted. It's stored in the Library of Congress, and it's available for anyone who wants to listen. And what's amazing, there are two amazing things going on here. The first thing is that people actually take the time, two people, the interviewer and the interviewee, to tell their story. And the other is that people are actually listening to these stories. They're listening on the radio, they're listening on podcasts, they're listening on the StoryCorps website, they're listening in booths at the Library of Congress, and they're listening around the country because there are also StoryCorps listening booths where people step inside and listen to someone they don't know tell the story of their life. So what that little experiment, that successful experiment proves, I think, is something incredible about what makes us so powerfully human, what makes humanity who we are. That stories, the stories we tell each other, are really at the core of what it is to be us, to be human. Storytelling brings more meaning to our lives than simply stating a fact. When it's wrapped in a story, it has so much more depth and meaning and impact. And there's one more essential truth about human storytelling, and this is really important. Stories don't have to be factual to be impactful. Stories don't have to be accurate to be meaningful. Because we know that great authors create fantasies, products of their imagination that are some of the most compelling stories that we read. And we know that every single character in those stories is made up, but it doesn't matter. Think about Charles Dickens. Think about Jules Verne and his stories. Think about F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby and how many movies have been made from that story because it's such a good story. Think about Ayn Rand and George Orwell, and you could name your own favorite authors. They're all writing fantasy, but the stories are compelling and they hold us, and we spend time talking about them because there's so much meaning in them, and they give direction and guidance, and they give value to our own lives. They transmit in so many ways powerful lessons and enduring truths. So I was reminded of this certainty of storytelling when I read a brief essay by Rupert Murdoch in Time magazine. Now, he's the CEO of 21st Century Fox. 20th Century Fox? 20th Century Fox. He's the owner of several newspapers throughout the world. And what he said in this article simply was, storytelling defines our world. And that's not a bad thing for someone who's trying to sell us movies and TV shows to say, but it's a truth. Because narratives are what move people to action. And unfortunately, they move people to action for good and for evil. Think about the stories of America's greatness that inspires all of us to be patriots, or the stories of Israel's founding that drives us to be proud Zionists. Politicians also tell stories. They invite our support, and sometimes they drive us away. And there are distorted and perverse stories, the likes of which are told by the terrorists of ISIS that recruit more terrorists. Stories are powerful for good and for evil. And what Murdoch wonders is which stories will claim us in 2016 in his essay. He says, we'll have to see if 2016 will be a year which stories of anger, grievance, resentment, and scapegoating of the other are ascendant, or whether stories of the power of love, empathy, and hope for a better day and a better future rule the day. So it's no surprise, knowing the power of storytelling, that stories are really central to what it means to be a Jew. You can't be a Jew without claiming and holding on to and valuing and telling the stories. And we've been retelling and telling and listening and telling and retelling stories about ourselves for thousands of years. And of course, the master story is in the ark behind me. It opens with Genesis, and Genesis is family stories, stories of births, of deaths, of personal victories and failures. It's Abraham's saga of a long barren wife, of a desperately anticipated son, of a difficult relationship with a stepson, of personal frustrations and victories. You can imagine our ancestors sitting in their stone huts, regaling each other with these tales, and you can imagine how fluid they were over many, many, many centuries of telling and retelling. Details that were as fluid as the shifting sands of the Middle East, and they were changed by the storyteller and remembered differently by each listener. But the stories about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, they captured ancient truths, if not ancient facts, and because of the compelling truths that are in the stories, we still read them, and we still tell them, and we still talk about them, because they're meaningful today. So we're now in the seasonal cycle of Torah readings where we read one of the greatest stories that humankind has ever told. And it's that story of our journey out of Egypt. Now here, in Exodus, the story isn't family dynamics. In Exodus, it's about the foundation of a nation. It's a story of Jewish becoming. A leaderless band of slaves becomes a people held together by Torah. And what's amazing about the Torah and the story of the Exodus is that the storytelling of the Jewish people doesn't end with the fifth book of the Bible, of the Torah, it continues even today as Jewish becoming continues here in this land, in the land of Israel, and wherever Jews live around the world. Like all great stories, the storytelling of the Torah transcends time and place. Facts are insignificant. It's drama that captures us. It's eternal truths. So what Torah teaches is that mere existence isn't sufficient, that a person has to have principles to live, that laws have to guide us, that ethics have to shape us, that we have to care for the stranger, honor our parents, pay the wages of our employees. Those are the stories captured in Torah. That we have to build a spiritual life, the Torah says. We have to contemplate God and what God's presence means in our lives. We have to contemplate the meaning of prayer and wrestle with what it means to pray, and reflect on the power of rituals and what they mean, and discover that there's a sense of purpose that comes from telling those stories and living them out in our lives. So ultimately, we must live our lives conscious of the fact that we are crafting stories and telling stories, and that there will be those who are going to remember the stories that we tell in their lives. It says in the Torah, you should tell your children of your departure from Egypt. And we read the words in the prayer book together that said, wherever you go, it is eternal Egypt. That's how stories work. They're not bound by time. And so it's on each of us to tell our stories, interwoven with the stories of our people that reveal our truths. There's a Hasidic tale that reminds us of the redemptive power of storytelling. It's said that the great rabbi, the founder of Hasidism, the Rabbi Baal Shem Tov, whenever he perceived misfortune threatening the Jews, would go to a certain part of the forest. And there he'd light a fire, and there he'd say a prayer. And because of his actions, whatever misfortune was about to befall the Jews would be averted. Upon his death, his disciple, the Maggid of Metzrich, led the people. And whenever his people faced misfortune, he'd go to the same place in the forest, but he'd say, Master of the universe, I don't know how to light the fire, but I know the prayer. And he'd recite the prayer, and it was sufficient. And still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, his disciple, would be called upon to save the people. And he'd go into the forest, and he'd say, Master of the universe, I don't even know how to light the fire. I don't even know the prayer. But I know the spot in the forest, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Years later, it fell to Rabbi Israel of Ryzen to overcome his misfortune. And he'd sit in his armchair, his head in his hands, and he'd speak to God, and he'd say, Master of the universe, I'm unable to light the fire. I don't even know the prayer. I can't even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. And this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. So from this, the Hasidim conclude, God made humans because they love stories. That's our truth. We all have stories to tell. They needn't be tales of heroism. They don't have to be national epics. They only need to be ours, our truths, our stories. And when we tell them, and when others listen, they reveal what is so essential to ourselves, to our existence, to the truths that direct our lives. And what we hope is that when we tell the story, and there are those who listen, that will be sufficient.